Phuc Yen Air Base, North Vietnam, January 2, 1967, 1500 hours local time, and Captain Nguyen Van Coc sat in the cockpit of his MiG-21 watching ground controllers scramble his squadron toward what radar identified as American F-105 Thunderchiefs approaching Hanoi, their electronic signatures matching the bomb-laden strike packages that had been hitting targets across the Red River Delta for months. Unaware that Colonel Robin Olds and the pilots of the United States Air Force 8th Tactical Fighter Wing had spent weeks planning an elaborate deception that would turn this routine intercept into the most devastating 15 minutes in the history of the Vietnam People's Air Force, a trap so complete that half of North Vietnam's entire MiG-21 fleet would be burning wreckage before the sun set over the Karst Mountains to the west. The radio crackled with instructions from the ground control intercept station, vectors calculated to position the MiG-21s behind the American formation where their atoll missiles could exploit the vulnerable rear quarter of the heavily loaded fighter bombers, the same tactic that had worked successfully against F-105 formations 17 times in the previous 4 months, each victory confirming what Soviet advisors had taught during training in Krasnodar and what combat experience had reinforced over the skies of Hanoi, that properly executed hit-and-run attacks could neutralize American technological advantages through superior tactics and ground-based radar control. Coase checked his instruments as his MiG-21 accelerated through 600 kilometers per hour, the Tumansky R-11 engine responding smoothly to throttle inputs, 2 atoll infrared missiles hanging from underwing pylons ready to track the hot exhaust of American jet engines, fuel tanks showing sufficient reserves for a 20-minute engagement before he would need to break off and return to base. Everything proceeding exactly according to the intercept profile drilled into every pilot of the 921st Fighter Regiment. But as Coc and his wingman Dang Ngoc Ngu climbed through the cloud layer at 4,000 meters, breaking into clear sky where visibility extended for dozens of kilometers in every direction, the tactical situation began fragmenting into patterns that matched no previous engagement, no training scenario, no briefing from Soviet instructors who had spent years analyzing American air operations. The aircraft ahead were flying F-105 approach routes, maintaining F-105 formations, broadcasting F-105 radio calls, even carrying the same electronic countermeasures pods that characterized Thunderchief strike packages. But something fundamental was wrong with the geometry of the engagement, with the way these aircraft maneuvered when the MiG-21s appeared on their radar, with the aggressive turn toward the Vietnamese fighters, rather than the expected defensive breakaway from the threat axis. The first indication that this was no ordinary F-105 formation came when the lead American aircraft rolled inverted and pulled through 6 Gs to position behind Nguyen Ha Chiu's MiG-21, a maneuver impossible for a bomb-laden Thunderchief but routine for a clean F-4 Phantom configured for air-to-air combat, the realization hitting Coc in the same instant that he saw the distinctive twin engines and anhedral tail of a McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, where his briefing had promised only single-engine F-105s. The Americans had deceived ground control, deceived the radar operators, deceived the intelligence analysts who spent hours studying electronic signatures and flight patterns, deceived every layer of North Vietnam's integrated air defense system by making F-4 Phantoms look exactly like F-105 Thunderchiefs until the trap was already sprung and MiG-21s were surrounded by the most capable air superiority fighters in the American inventory. Chiu's MiG exploded 3 seconds later, hit by an AIM-9 Sidewinder fired from a range of 800 meters by a Phantom that had accelerated to Mach 1.2 in the dive, the missile's infrared seeker tracking flawlessly to the hot tailpipe of the Vietnamese fighter. Detonation, sending a mushroom cloud of orange flame and black smoke tumbling through the afternoon sky as pieces of aluminum and steel traced ballistic arcs toward the rice paddies 15,000 feet below. Coc broke hard right, pulling maximum G, until his vision tunneled and his pressure suit inflated around his legs to prevent blood pooling, the MiG-21's delta wing design allowing instantaneous turn rates that should have defeated any American fighter. But when he rolled wings level to assess the tactical situation, two more Phantoms were already positioned behind him, their AN/APQ-100 radar systems tracking his every maneuver, their AEM-7 Sparrow missiles capable of engaging from beyond visual range using radar guidance that Vietnamese pilots could not defeat with agility alone. The radio became chaos, Vietnamese voices calling breaks and warnings and kill confirmations all compressed into overlapping transmissions that made tactical coordination impossible, ground control trying to vector remaining MiG-21s away from the engagement. But the Americans had positioned blocking forces to cut off every escape route, F-4 Phantoms from the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing orbiting between the battle and the Chinese border to prevent MiGs from fleeing north to Sanctuary. Other Phantom flights positioned above Phuc Yen and Gia Lam airfields to intercept any fighter attempting to land with American missiles, chasing it down final approach. This was not air combat as Vietnamese pilots had trained for, not the carefully controlled intercepts where ground radar gave them every advantage, not the hit-and-run attacks that exploited American rules of engagement. This was comprehensive domination by an enemy who understood Vietnamese tactics better than the Vietnamese understood American capabilities, who had studied every pattern and radio call and approach route until they could replicate them perfectly enough to lure North Vietnam's most advanced fighters into a killing zone with no escape. Coc firewalled his throttle and dove toward the deck, airspeed increasing through 1,100 kilometers per hour as he used the MiG-21's speed advantage to open distance from the pursuing Phantoms. But even this desperate maneuver revealed the depth of American technological superiority because the F-4 pilots matched his dive and maintained pursuit, despite his aircraft theoretically being capable of Mach 2.05 against their Mach 2.23. The small speed difference meaningless when both aircraft were already supersonic and the Americans had better radar, better missiles, better training, better everything, except the desperation of pilots fighting over their own homeland. At 2,000 feet altitude, Coc pulled out of the dive, G-forces crushing him into his seat as the MiG-21's airframe groaned under structural loads approaching design limits, and for a moment he thought he had escaped, thought the terrain clutter would break the American radar lock, thought he could run at treetop level back to Phuc Yen, where anti-aircraft artillery would force the Phantoms to break off their pursuit. Then his threat warning receiver screamed, the distinct audio tone indicating an AIM-7 Sparrow missile in active radar homing mode, incoming from his 6 o'clock position at 3,000 feet per second closing speed. And Coc knew with absolute certainty that no amount of maneuvering would defeat a missile that could track through his turns using its own radar seeker, that his MiG-21's superior turn rate meant nothing against a weapon that pulled 12 Gs sustained and 20 Gs instantaneously, that his 4 years of training in the Soviet Union and 6 months of combat experience over North Vietnam had not prepared him for this moment when American technology rendered Vietnamese tactics completely obsolete. He ejected at 250 meters altitude, the canopy blasting away in a shower of shattered plexiglass, the rocket-propelled seat firing him clear of the aircraft half a second before the Sparrow's fragmentation warhead detonated against his MiG's tail section, parachute deploying automatically as he tumbled through smoke and debris, the ground rushing up to meet him, while American F-4 Phantoms circled overhead like predators that had already moved on to other prey because shooting down one MiG-21 was merely Tuesday afternoon work for pilots who flew aircraft, so advanced they could engage multiple targets simultaneously using radar-guided missiles that killed from beyond the range, where Vietnamese fighters could even identify their attackers. Coc hit a rice paddy at 15 kilometers per hour, knee joints absorbing the impact, parachute collapsing into the water behind him as he struggled out of his harness and survival gear, looking up to see 4 more fireballs marking the deaths of his squadron mates. 4 more North Vietnamese pilots floating down on parachutes or riding their burning MiG-21s into the ground, because they had been lured into battle against an enemy they did not understand, fighting aircraft they could not match, using tactics that had been completely compromised by American intelligence. This was supposed to be a routine intercept against bomb-laden F-105s. This was supposed to add another victory to the tally that proved Soviet-trained pilots could defeat American technological advantages through superior tactics and courage. This was supposed to demonstrate that David could still beat Goliath if David was clever enough and brave enough and willing to sacrifice enough. But instead, it had revealed the fundamental truth that would shape every aerial engagement for the rest of the war, that the F-4 Phantom II, with its Mach 2 speed and radar-guided missiles and 2-man crew, represented a generational leap in fighter technology that no amount of tactical skill could overcome when the Americans chose to fight on their terms rather than accepting the constraints of Vietnamese operational patterns. The disaster at Phuc Yen on January 2, 1967, destroyed 7 MiG-21s in 15 minutes, nearly half of North Vietnam's entire inventory of supersonic interceptors, forcing the Vietnam People's Air Force to ground its remaining MiG-21s for 3 months, while Soviet advisors completely rebuilt their tactical doctrine and training programs. But this catastrophe was not the beginning of North Vietnamese struggles against the F-4 Phantom. It was merely the most dramatic demonstration of a technological mismatch that had been killing Vietnamese pilots since April 1965, when the first Phantoms arrived in Southeast Asia, carrying capabilities that made the aircraft's performance envelope as important as its weapon systems. Understanding how comprehensively outclassed North Vietnam's fighters were by the F-4 requires examining not just individual engagements, but the systematic advantages that American technology delivered across every aspect of air combat, advantages so fundamental that they shaped strategy at the highest levels of command in Hanoi and Moscow, advantages that forced North Vietnam to build an entirely different model of air defense because conventional fighter-versus-fighter combat had become a casualty exchange rate that no small air force could sustain. The technological gap began with basic performance parameters that defined what was physically possible in aerial combat. And here the numbers told a story of such overwhelming disparity that Vietnamese pilots facing F-4 Phantoms were essentially fighting from a previous generation of aviation technology. The difference between their capabilities and American capabilities, as stark as the gap between propeller fighters and early jets, had been 2 decades earlier. The F-4 Phantom II could reach Mach 2.23 or 1,472 miles per hour at altitude, giving it a maximum speed 400 miles per hour, faster than the MiG-17's Mach 0.97, faster even than the MiG-21's Mach 2.05, in certain flight regimes where the Phantom's twin General Electric J-79 engines delivered 35,000 pounds of thrust, combined against the MiG-21's single Tumansky R-11, producing 14,300 pounds with afterburner. This speed advantage meant American pilots could choose when to engage and when to disengage, could pursue Vietnamese fighters who tried to escape, could outrun surface-to-air missiles during egress from target areas, could dictate every aspect of the tactical geometry because they flew aircraft that moved through the sky faster than anything North Vietnam possessed. But speed alone did not explain F-4 dominance. The real advantage came from combining that speed with weapon systems that could kill from distances where Vietnamese fighters had no chance to shoot back, creating what American tacticians called beyond visual range engagement capabilities that fundamentally changed the nature of air combat. The AN/APQ-100 pulse radar in the F-4 Phantom could detect targets at ranges exceeding 30 miles, track multiple contacts simultaneously, provide range and closure rate data accurate enough to guide the AEM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missile to intercept, all while the Vietnamese pilot being tracked had no indication he was under attack until the missile's active radar seeker went into terminal homing phase. The AIM-7 Sparrow could engage targets at ranges up to 12 miles, could pull 12G sustained turns to track maneuvering aircraft, could close at Mach 3.5 speed that gave Vietnamese pilots less than 10 seconds from detection to impact, even if their primitive threat warning systems detected the launch, a weapon system so advanced that it rendered the MiG-17's gun-only armament completely obsolete because the battle was over before Vietnamese pilots closed to gun range. Even the MiG-21 with its Atoll infrared missiles could not match F-4 engagement capabilities, the K-13 Atoll being a reverse-engineered copy of the early AIM-9 Sidewinder with maximum range of 4 miles and requiring a pure tail chase geometry where the missile seeker could track the target's engine exhaust, meaning MiG-21 pilots had to maneuver into a position directly behind American aircraft to employ their only air-to-air missile, a maneuver that put them in the perfect position to be engaged by the Phantom's rear hemisphere Sparrow shots or tail chase Sidewinders from the American fighter's wingman. The tactical mathematics were brutal. F-4 Phantoms could shoot from 12 miles with radar missiles and 4 miles with infrared missiles in almost any geometry, while MiG-21s needed to achieve a perfect 6 o'clock position within 2 miles to employ weapons, and MiG-17s with their gun-only armament needed to close to within 1,000 meters in a stable firing position that required 3 to 5 seconds of controlled flight, requirements that were nearly impossible to achieve against pilots who could see them coming from 30 miles away and engage with missiles from distances where Vietnamese fighters could not even identify their attackers. The F-4's two-man crew delivered another systematic advantage that multiplied the aircraft's effectiveness in ways that single-seat MiG-17 and MiG-21 pilots could never match. The division of labor between pilot and radar intercept officer, creating a team that could handle complex radar operations, weapons employment, navigation, and tactical decision-making simultaneously while maintaining situational awareness across a three-dimensional battle space extending dozens of miles in every direction. The pilot flew the aircraft and handled basic air combat maneuvering, while the radar intercept officer in the rear seat operated the AN/APQ-100 radar, managed the weapon systems, monitored threat warnings, communicated with ground control and other flight members, navigated through weather and at night, essentially serving as a second brain dedicated to all the tasks that would have overloaded a single pilot trying to dogfight and run radar and employ weapons all at once. Vietnamese pilots facing this two-man crew were fighting alone, managing their own radar systems if they flew MiG-21s, relying on ground control for vectors if they flew MiG-17s, trying to track targets and avoid threats and navigate and fight all simultaneously, the mental workload so intense that many Vietnamese pilots later reported losing situational awareness during engagements simply because one human brain could not process all the information required for modern jet combat. North Vietnamese pilots understood these disadvantages intimately, discussed them endlessly in briefings and after-action reports, reported them to Soviet advisors who compiled detailed studies of American technological advantages. But understanding the problem did not provide solutions because the gap was not in training or tactics, but in fundamental industrial capacity, in the ability to design and manufacture radar systems and guided missiles and powerful jet engines at the sophistication levels that American technology delivered routinely. A MiG-17 cost approximately $200,000 United States dollars to produce in Soviet factories, while an F-4 Phantom II cost $2.4 million, the 12-fold price difference reflecting not just inflation or profiteering, but the reality that the Phantom contained radar systems more complex than entire MiG-17 airframes, carried missiles whose guidance electronics represented miniaturized versions of ground-based radar stations, employed engines that delivered thrust-to-weight ratios Soviet designers would not match for another decade, incorporated avionics and flight control systems that required precision manufacturing capabilities beyond what Warsaw-packed factories could produce in the mid-1960s. This industrial reality shaped North Vietnamese tactics from the earliest days of the air war, forcing the Vietnam People's Air Force to develop operational methods that avoided direct fighter-versus-fighter combat whenever possible, instead using their limited numbers of jets as one component of an integrated air defense system that combined surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, ground-based radar, and fighters into a coordinated whole designed to force American aircraft into kill zones rather than attempting to defeat them in fair fights. The famous double attack tactic exemplified this approach, using 4 MiG-17s as bait to lure American fighter escorts into turning battles at low altitude where the subsonic MiGs had some maneuverability advantage, while 2 MiG-21s attacked from above and behind using hit-and-run supersonic passes that minimized exposure to American radar missiles, the whole engagement controlled by ground-based radar that could vector Vietnamese fighters into optimal attack positions while monitoring the locations of all American aircraft in the battle space. When this tactic worked, it produced occasional victories that North Vietnamese propaganda celebrated extensively, but the casualty exchange rates revealed the underlying reality between April 1965 and January 1973. The United States Air Force claimed 107.5 MiG kills at a cost of 33 F-4 Phantoms in air-to-air combat, a 3.2 to 1 kill ratio that would have destroyed the entire Vietnam People's Air Force several times over, except that North Vietnam carefully controlled when and where it fought, accepting that most American strike packages would hit their targets unopposed rather than risking aircraft in battles where F-4 technological advantages made defeat nearly certain. The statistics from Operation Rolling Thunder between March 1965 and November 1968 demonstrated how completely F-4 capabilities dominated the air war during this period. The United States flew more than 300,000 strike sorties against North Vietnamese targets, averaging 850 sorties per day during peak operations. And yet North Vietnam's fighter force managed to intercept only a small fraction of these raids because every engagement risked losing MiGs to an enemy who could detect them from 30 miles away, track their every maneuver, engage with missiles from beyond visual range, and still outrun them if Vietnamese pilots somehow managed to survive the initial missile exchange and close to gun range. During the entire 3.5-year Rolling Thunder campaign, United States forces lost only 40 F-4 Phantoms to MiGs out of more than 1,000 Phantoms deployed to Southeast Asia, while North Vietnam lost 131 MiGs in air-to-air combat from a total fighter force that never exceeded 200 aircraft at any time. The mathematics of attrition so unfavorable that the Vietnam People's Air Force spent more time stood down for reconstitution than it spent actively defending North Vietnamese airspace, with lengthy stand-down periods after Operation Bolo, after heavy losses in April and May 1967, after a disastrous engagement on August 23, 1967, whenever American kill rates spiked high enough to threaten the institutional survival of the fighter force. Even the tactics that North Vietnam developed to counter F-4 advantages ultimately proved ineffective against American pilots who adapted faster than Vietnamese doctrine could evolve, the pattern repeating throughout the war where Vietnamese innovations would achieve brief success until American aircrews figured out the countermeasures and Vietnamese losses climbed back to unsustainable levels. The supersonic stern attack using MiG-21s in ground-controlled hit-and-run passes worked brilliantly when first employed in late 1966, shooting down 5 F-4 Phantoms in December while taking only 2 losses. But by March 1967, American pilots had learned to maintain higher cruise speeds that negated the MiG-21's ability to to catch bomb-laden formations, to position combat air patrols between known MiG bases and the strike routes, to employ radar-guided Sparrow missiles in head-on shots that killed MiG-21s during their approach before they could achieve the 6 o'clock firing position their atoll missiles required. And by June 1967, the tactic's effectiveness had collapsed, with Vietnamese pilots losing 11 MiG-21s in that month alone, against only 3 F-4 kills. The 17-3 casualty exchange rate from December reversed into an 11-3 slaughter that forced another stand-down while Soviet advisors tried to develop new approaches. The pattern repeated with the double attack combination of MiG-17s and MiG-21s, which achieved dramatic success on August 23, 1967, shooting down 3 American aircraft, 2 F-4 Phantoms, and 1 F-1-oh-5 Thunderchief, by perfectly executing the coordinated attack with MiG-17s baiting the escorts while MiG-21s struck from altitude. But even this tactical victory came at terrible cost. The Americans shot down 1 MiG-21 during the engagement, and another MiG-17 pilot was killed when his own anti-aircraft artillery mistook him for an American fighter. And within weeks, United States fighter crews had developed countermeasures that involved splitting escort forces into high and low combat air patrols, specifically designed to counter altitude separation tactics, using radar-guided missiles to engage high-speed attackers from head-on aspects before they could achieve firing position, accepting that some MiG-17s might score gun kills against aircraft that maneuvered down to engage them, because the overall exchange rate still favored American forces so heavily that losing 1 Phantom to kill 3 MiGs was acceptable mathematics. North Vietnamese pilots who survived these engagements later described the psychological impact of fighting an enemy whose technological advantages made victory feel impossible, no matter how skilled or brave or tactically innovative Vietnamese aircrews became. The knowledge that every combat mission might be their last, because American radar could find them anywhere. American missiles could kill them from ranges where they could not shoot back. American speed could chase them down if they tried to escape. American numbers could replace losses far faster than Soviet production could replenish North Vietnamese squadrons. Nguyen Van Bai, the most successful MiG-17 ace with 7 confirmed victories, later recalled that even his most successful missions involved more luck than skill, depending on American pilots making mistakes or rules of engagement preventing them from firing until visual identification range, circumstances that skilled enemies could avoid simply by following their own doctrine rather than accommodating Vietnamese tactical requirements. "We won when they fought our way," Bay explained to American historians decades after the war ended. "But they almost never fought our way after the first year. They learned what we could do, and then they just stayed outside our range and killed us with missiles. There was no honor in dying to technology you could not defeat, only the knowledge that you had done your duty, even when your duty was flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy who owned the sky." The introduction of the F-4 Phantom II's E model in 1967 added another dimension to North Vietnamese disadvantages, installing an internal M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon that gave Phantoms a gun option when missiles failed or when rules of engagement prevented beyond visual range shots, essentially eliminating the one scenario where MiG-17s had some advantage in close-range turning fights. The M61 could fire 6,000 rounds per minute with a muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second, creating a cone of fire so dense that a 1-second burst put 100 c. 20mm shells into a volume of airspace the size of a football field. And because the gun was bore-sighted into the aircraft with modern lead computing gun sights, F-4 pilots could track turning targets and kill them with gunfire from ranges where MiG-17 pilots were still trying to achieve the stable firing position their slower-firing 37mm and 23mm cannons required. The first gun kill by an F-4E model occurred on May 12, 1968, when Major Champ Henderson shot down a MiG-17 at 600 meters range in a diving attack. And when Vietnamese pilots analyzed the engagement, they realized with despair that Americans had now closed the only gap in F-4 capabilities, that even in close-range dogfights where MiG-17 agility should have provided some advantage, the Phantom's superior speed and two-man crew and modern gun sight made it deadly with guns, that there was literally no flight regime where North Vietnamese fighters had technological parity, let alone superiority, against the most capable fighter bomber in the American inventory. Soviet advisors who studied these engagements sent detailed reports back to Moscow describing the scale of American technological advantages and recommending that North Vietnam receive more advanced aircraft, specifically the MiG-23 with its swing-wing design and look-down, shoot-down radar and beyond visual range missile capabilities that might provide some parity against F-4 Phantoms. But Soviet leadership rejected these requests because providing such advanced systems to North Vietnam risked technology transfer to the United States if aircraft were shot down or pilots defected, and because the broader strategic calculation in Moscow held that tying down American air power in Southeast Asia served Soviet interests even if North Vietnamese pilots died in obsolete aircraft, that every F-4 committed to Vietnam was one fewer Phantom available to defend Western Europe against Soviet bombers. This cynical calculation meant North Vietnamese pilots continued flying MiG-17s and MiG-21s throughout the war, despite knowing these aircraft were fundamentally outclassed, continued executing tactics that accepted unsustainable loss rates because no other options existed, continued dying in technological mismatches that Soviet industrial capacity could have corrected, but Soviet strategic priorities deemed acceptable casualties. The operational pattern that emerged from these realities saw the Vietnam People's Air Force functioning less as an independent striking arm and more as a component of integrated air defense designed to complicate American planning rather than actually controlling airspace, the fighter force accepting that it could not prevent American bombers from reaching targets but hoping to force them to jettison ordnance early or divert to secondary targets or abort missions entirely by threatening enough losses to make the strike packages politically unsustainable. This defensive strategy sometimes worked, particularly when combined with dense surface-to-air missile coverage and heavy anti-aircraft artillery that together created such hazardous environments that American commanders restricted missions or changed tactics to reduce aircraft losses. But the strategy's success depended entirely on American political will rather than North Vietnamese military capability, and when American leadership decided to accept higher loss rates during major operations like Linebacker and Second in 1972, North Vietnamese fighters became nearly irrelevant to outcomes because F-4 Phantoms simply destroyed them whenever they tried to interfere with strike packages. The Linebacker I campaign from May to October 1972 demonstrated conclusively how technological superiority translated into operational dominance when American political constraints were loosened, the 5 months of intensive bombing seeing 201 air-to-air engagements that killed 54 North Vietnamese fighters, 26 MiG-21s, 5 MiG-19s, and 16 MiG-17s, while United States forces lost only 14 aircraft to MiGs during the same period, almost a 4-to-1 exchange ratio that would have completely annihilated the Vietnam People's Air Force, except that Soviet and Chinese replacements allowed North Vietnam to continue operations despite losses that exceeded sustainable attrition rates. During the single day of May 10, 1972, the opening day of Linebacker the First, American forces flew 414 combat sorties against North Vietnamese targets and shot down 11 MiGs, 7 MiG-17s, and 4 MiG-21s, in exchange for 4 American aircraft lost to all causes including surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. The 11-to-4 exchange ratio on a day when North Vietnam committed its entire fighter force to battle demonstrating that even desperate all-out defense could not prevent American aircraft from reaching their targets when F-4 Phantoms provided escort. The psychological impact of this technological mismatch on North Vietnamese pilots created problems that Soviet advisors reported as morale crises requiring political intervention to prevent unit cohesion from collapsing, instances where pilots refused combat missions or claimed equipment malfunctions or simply failed to intercept American formations because they knew the probable outcome of any engagement against F-4 Phantoms. After Operation Bolo destroyed half the MiG-21 fleet, several pilots from the 921st Fighter Regiment requested transfer to ground duties or training positions, explicitly stating they would not fly combat missions against Phantoms in aircraft they knew to be inferior, a crisis serious enough that the Vietnam People's Air Force commander personally visited the unit to restore discipline and explain that their sacrifice served the broader struggle even when individual missions appeared suicidal. "You are not fighting to win air superiority," the commander reportedly told his pilots. "You are fighting to make them pay enough that their people will demand they stop. Every aircraft you force to jettison bombs is a victory. Every mission you make them abort is a victory. Your death in combat serves the revolution, even if you shoot down nothing, because your willingness to fly against superior enemies proves our determination will outlast their technology." This grim calculation defined North Vietnamese aerial strategy for the remainder of the war, accepting that technological inferiority made conventional victory impossible, but hoping that political will could compensate for military capability. That American public opinion would force constraints on operations even when American technology could dominate any engagement. The strategy achieved its ultimate goal when American combat operations ended in January 1973, with North Vietnam still possessing a functional, if battered, air force, proving that survival itself constituted victory when facing an enemy who could have destroyed the entire Vietnam People's Air Force systematically if political will had matched technological capability. But the human cost of this strategy lived in the memories of surviving pilots who had watched friends die in aircraft that could not match enemy performance, who had flown missions knowing the radar-guided missiles would likely kill them before they ever saw their attackers, who had faced technological superiority so overwhelming that courage and skill and tactical innovation proved insufficient substitutes for modern weapon systems. The specific technical capabilities of the F-4 Phantom CQ that made it so dominant in the skies over North Vietnam warrant detailed examination because understanding these systems explains not just individual victories, but the systematic nature of American air superiority throughout the war, capabilities that emerged from industrial investment and technological development programs that North Vietnam and the Soviet Union simply could not match in the time frames that mattered for Southeast Asian operations. The AN/APQ-100 radar system installed in most F-4 variants represented a miniaturized version of ground-based early warning radars using pulse Doppler technology to detect targets against ground clutter, track while scan modes to monitor multiple contacts simultaneously, range gating to filter out false returns, all packaged in a nose-mounted antenna that weighed less than 200 pounds, but delivered capabilities equivalent to radar systems that occupied entire buildings in earlier generations of detection technology. When a radar intercept officer powered up the AN/APQ-100 and began searching sectors, he could detect fighter-sized targets at ranges exceeding 30 miles in clear conditions, distinguish between multiple aircraft in formation, determine target altitude and heading and speed with accuracy sufficient to calculate intercept geometry, all while the target being tracked had no indication of illumination unless equipped with threat warning receivers that most MiG-17s and early MiG-21s completely lacked. The radar system interfaced directly with the AIM-7 Sparrow missile, providing target tracking data that the missile's semi-active radar homing seeker used for mid-course guidance. the Phantom's radar continuously illuminating the target with energy that the Sparrow seeker followed to intercept, creating a kill chain that began with detection at 30 miles, progressed through target identification and firing solution calculation by the radar intercept officer, culminated in missile launch at ranges up to 12 miles, and ended with the Sparrow's fragmentation warhead detonating within lethal radius of the target aircraft, all accomplished while the target pilot might never know he was under attack until the missile's active terminal seeker went into homing mode in the final seconds before impact. This beyond visual range capability fundamentally changed air combat tactics, allowing F-4 crews to thin out MiG formations before dogfighting even began, to kill flight leaders and disrupt tactical coordination, to force Vietnamese pilots into defensive maneuvers that burned fuel and degraded formation integrity, all from distances where MiG-17 guns and MiG-21 atoll missiles posed zero threat to the attacking Phantoms. The AEM-9 Sidewinder infrared missile provided close-range firepower when targets maneuvered inside Sparrow minimum range or when visual identification rules prevented beyond visual range shots. The Sidewinder's heat-seeking guidance system tracking the infrared signature of jet engine exhaust with increasing sophistication as newer models entered service throughout the war. The AEM-9B model used early in the conflict could only track from directly behind the target in pure tail chase geometry, but the AEM-9D, introduced in 1965, could lock targets from broader aspect angles, and the AIM-9G, entering service in 1967, featured improved seekers that could track maneuvering targets through modest G-loading, giving F-4 pilots the ability to shoot from positions that MiG-21 atoll missiles could never achieve. The Sidewinder's maximum range of 4 miles exceeded the effective firing range of MiG-17 cannons by a factor of 10, meaning F-4 pilots could shoot and kill Vietnamese fighters before those fighters could bring their guns to bear, and the missile's Mach 2.5 speed gave targets less than 8 seconds from launch to impact, even at maximum range, reaction time so compressed that evasive maneuvers often proved too late to defeat the incoming missile, even when pilots recognized the threat immediately. The twin General Electric J79 turbojet engines that powered the F-4 Phantom Sekou delivered performance characteristics that multiplied the effectiveness of the radar and missile systems by providing the speed and acceleration necessary to execute tactics that weapon systems made possible, each J79 producing 17,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner, the combined 35,000 pounds of thrust giving a fully loaded Phantom a thrust-to-weight ratio approaching 1-to-1 under combat conditions after weapons release and fuel burn. This massive power allowed F-4 crews to accelerate from subsonic cruise to Mach 2.2 in less than 2 minutes of full afterburner, to climb at rates exceeding 40,000 feet per minute when clean, to sustain supersonic speed at altitudes where MiG-17s could barely reach subsonic, to outrun any threat except the newest surface-to-air missiles that North Vietnam deployed only in limited numbers around critical targets. The speed advantage meant F-4 pilots could dictate engagement terms, could pursue MiGs that tried to escape, could break off attacks and egress at speeds that made interception impossible, could transit to and from target areas faster than Vietnamese ground controllers, could vector fighters into blocking positions, essentially controlling tempo and initiative throughout every phase of air operations. The Phantom's weapons capacity added another dimension to its capabilities. The aircraft's 9 external hardpoints able to carry combinations that allowed simultaneous air-to-air and air-to-ground missions, mixing radar-guided Sparrows, infrared Sidewinders, 20mm gun pods, bombs, rockets, fuel tanks in loadouts that could be reconfigured based on mission requirements. A typical configuration for bomber escort missions would include 4 AIM-7 Sparrows on fuselage stations, 4 AIM-9 Sidewinders on wing pylons, and an SUU-16 20mm gun pod on the centerline, giving the aircraft 8 missiles and 1,200 rounds of 20mm ammunition for dealing with enemy fighters. A typical strike configuration would substitute bombs or rockets for the centerline gun pod while retaining the air-to-air missiles for self-defense, allowing the Phantom to bomb targets and fight its way out if intercepted, something no MiG-17 or MiG-21 could accomplish because their air-to-air configurations left no capacity for strike ordnance, and their strike configurations left them nearly defenseless against fighters. This multi-role capability meant every F-4 Phantom in theater could switch missions based on tactical requirements, fighter escorts becoming bombers if enemy fighters stayed on the ground, bomber aircraft becoming fighter sweeps if MiGs appeared, the flexibility allowing American commanders to mass force packages that could overwhelm North Vietnamese defenses through sheer numbers of capable aircraft. The two-man crew arrangement that put a pilot in the front seat and a radar intercept officer in the rear seat created a tactical team that could handle workload levels impossible for single-seat fighters, the division of labor allowing each crew member to specialize in their portion of the mission while maintaining cross-monitoring that caught errors and provided redundancy against system failures. The pilot focused on flying the aircraft and basic air combat maneuvering, controlling flight path, managing energy and turning fights, watching for visual threats, employing the gun if equipped, but the radar intercept officer managed everything else, operating the complex AN/APQ-100 radar system, interpreting target returns and calculating intercept geometry, selecting and employing missiles, monitoring threat warnings from radar homing and warning systems, navigating using both radar ground mapping and traditional methods, communicating with air traffic control and ground control and other flight members, essentially serving as a dedicated systems operator who freed the pilot to concentrate on flying while ensuring that all the advanced technology the F-4 carried actually got employed effectively in combat. This crew coordination reached levels of efficiency that single-seat MiG pilots could never match. Radar intercept officers learning to anticipate their pilots' maneuvers and adjust radar scan patterns to maintain track on targets through violent evasive action, pilots learning to trust their RIO's calls and execute firing solutions without personally verifying target position because the radar operator could see threats the pilot would never detect visually, both crew members developing tactical shorthand and communication efficiency that allowed complex decisions to be made in seconds through brief radio calls. Contrast this with MiG-21 pilots who had to fly their aircraft, operate their less capable radar systems, manage their limited weapons, navigate by ground control vectors, communicate with controllers and wingmen, watch for threats, all while pulling G-forces that narrowed vision and degraded cognitive function, the single-pilot workload so extreme that many Vietnamese air crews later reported they never achieved full situational awareness during engagements because managing basic aircraft operation consumed mental capacity that American two-man crews could dedicate to tactical decision-making. North Vietnamese analysis of F-4 capabilities consistently identified the radar and missile systems as the primary advantages that made the Phantom nearly unbeatable in aerial combat, reports from surviving pilots emphasizing that speed and maneuverability mattered little when the enemy could detect and engage from ranges where Vietnamese fighters posed no threat. One particularly detailed after-action report from June 1967, written by a MiG-21 pilot who survived being shot down after his entire flight was destroyed, described the experience of being tracked by Phantom radar as fighting blind against an enemy who could see everything, who knew our position and speed and altitude while we knew nothing except what ground control told us, and even that information arrived too late because by the time controllers vectored us toward a target, the Americans had already moved and were positioning to shoot their missiles from outside our detection range. The report continued with technical observations about Sparrow missile performance that shocked Soviet advisors because the pilots' descriptions indicated capabilities beyond what intelligence estimates had predicted, specifically the missile's ability to track targets through moderate G-loading and its resistance to simple evasive maneuvers, suggesting American guidance technology had advanced beyond Soviet understanding of the systems. These Soviet advisors compiled extensive studies comparing F-4 Phantom capabilities to Soviet fighter technology, concluding that even the newest MiG-21 variants deployed to North Vietnam remained approximately one generation behind American fighters in critical systems, particularly radar performance and missile guidance. The Sapphire radar installed in MiG-21 PF variants could detect targets at only 15-mile maximum range under ideal conditions, half the detection range of the Phantom's AN/APQ-100, and lacked track-while-scan capability, meaning the pilot could only monitor one target at a time, while American radar intercept officers tracked up to 8 contacts simultaneously. The K-13 Atoll missile remained fundamentally limited by its infrared seeker that required near-perfect tail-chase geometry and clear line of sight to target exhaust, while the Sparrow's radar homing system could engage from multiple aspect angles and track through clouds and weather that would blind infrared guidance completely. Soviet recommendations consistently urged that North Vietnam receive more advanced systems, including the MiG-23 with its swing-wing design and improved radar. But political decisions in Moscow prevented these transfers, leaving North Vietnamese pilots to face technological superiority they could acknowledge but not counter. The operational statistics from 1972, the final year of intensive American air operations over North Vietnam, revealed how completely F-4 technological advantages dominated even when North Vietnamese tactics had evolved to their highest levels of sophistication after 8 years of learning. During Operation Linebacker, run from May to October 1972, American F-4 crews claimed 49 MiG kills while losing only 9 Phantoms in air-to-air combat, a 5.4-to-1 exchange ratio that demonstrated technological advantages had only increased as newer F-4 models entered service and American pilots incorporated lessons from earlier periods of the war. The single day of May 10, 1972, saw 11 MiGs shot down against 4 American losses to all causes, and when Vietnamese commanders analyzed that day's engagements, they found that every MiG destroyed had been engaged first by American radar missiles, fired from beyond the range where Vietnamese pilots could even detect their attackers. That tactical execution mattered less than technological capability because F-4 Phantoms could kill from distances where MiG-17s and MiG-21s simply could not fight back. The human reality behind these statistics lived in the experiences of pilots like Nguyen Van Coc, who survived Operation Bolo to become North Vietnam's leading ace with 7 confirmed aircraft kills and 2 drone kills, every one of his victories achieved using the K-13 Atoll infrared missile because his MiG-21's gun installation had been removed to save weight. Cox later described his tactical approach as finding the few moments when Americans made mistakes, or when we could surprise them before their radar found us, shooting quickly with the Atoll and escaping immediately because staying to fight meant dying to their Sparrows. Every mission was survival first and victory second, because no amount of skill could defeat their technology if they saw us coming and employed their systems properly. Even his most successful engagement, shooting down an F-4 Phantom on August 23, 1967, as part of the coordinated attack that killed 3 American aircraft, involved exploiting a moment when weather and ground clutter degraded American radar effectiveness, attacking from an altitude where his MiG-21's small radar cross-section made detection difficult, firing his missiles and diving away before the Americans could respond, tactics that required perfect execution and favorable conditions just to achieve what F-4 crews accomplished routinely using beyond visual range Sparrows against targets that had no idea they were under attack. The final aerial engagement between F-4 Phantoms and North Vietnamese MiGs occurred on January 12, 1973, 15 days before the Paris Peace Accords ended American combat operations when Lieutenant Victor Kowaleski and Ensign James Wise, flying an F-4B from Fighter Squadron 161 aboard USS Midway, shot down a MiG-17 flown by Liu Kim Ngo of the 923rd Fighter Regiment using AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. The engagement followed patterns that had been established 8 years earlier when Phantoms first deployed to Southeast Asia. Radar detection at long range, allowing the American crew to position for a tail-chase attack, infrared missile employment from 2 miles distance, giving the Vietnamese pilot no chance to evade. The MiG-17 exploding in a fireball that marked the end of aerial combat in a war where technological superiority had killed Vietnamese pilots from the first engagement to the last. Liu Kim Ngo ejected, but his parachute failed to deploy, and his body was recovered from the South China Sea, the final casualty of a technological mismatch that had claimed hundreds of North Vietnamese pilots who flew obsolete aircraft against enemies who could see them from 30 miles away, track their every maneuver, kill them from distances where they could not shoot back, dictate every aspect of tactical engagement through capabilities that Soviet technology could not match, and North Vietnamese industrial capacity could never hope to produce domestically. The legacy of F-4 Phantom dominance over North Vietnamese skies extended beyond simple victory statistics to shape how air forces worldwide understood the relationship between technology and tactics in modern warfare, demonstrating that courage and skill and tactical innovation could not compensate for fundamental gaps in sensor capability and weapons range and aircraft performance when those gaps reached generational proportions. North Vietnam's integrated air defense system succeeded in inflicting politically unsustainable losses on American operations, not through fighter versus fighter combat, where technological disparities made victory impossible, but through combined arms approaches that used surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery as primary killing mechanisms, while fighters served mainly to complicate American planning and force tactical responses that degraded strike effectiveness. This defensive strategy achieved its political goals when American combat operations ended in 1973, but the military reality remained that F-4 Phantoms had established air superiority so complete that North Vietnamese fighters could only operate when American rules of engagement and political constraints created windows of opportunity, that every engagement on American terms ended with Vietnamese losses that no amount of Soviet replacement aircraft could sustain indefinitely. The pilots who survived this technological mismatch carried memories of facing enemies they could not defeat through skill alone, of watching radar-guided missiles kill squadron mates from distances where Vietnamese fighters could not even identify their attackers, of flying aircraft whose capabilities seemed primitive compared to the systems that American technology delivered routinely. Nguyen Van Coc, reflecting on his 7 victories in a MiG-17 against F-4 Phantoms and F-8 Crusaders and F-1oh-5 Thunderchiefs, later told American historians that every victory required perfect conditions and American mistakes. We needed weather to hide our approach. We needed surprise to close before their radar found us. We needed them to violate their own doctrine by descending into turning fights where our agility mattered. And even when everything worked perfectly, we usually lost the overall engagement. Because killing one American aircraft often cost us 3 or 4 MiGs, the mathematics were impossible, but we fought anyway because our country demanded it, because survival itself became victory when facing technology we could not match. This acknowledgement from North Vietnam's most successful MiG-17 ace captured the fundamental reality that defined aerial combat throughout the war, that the F-4 Phantom II, with its Mach 2 speed and beyond visual range radar and missile systems, represented a quantum leap in fighter technology that rendered previous generations of aircraft essentially obsolete in conventional air-to-air combat, that courage and training and tactical sophistication could create brief moments of success, but could not overturn systematic advantages built into the physics of detection range and missile performance and aircraft speed. The United States Air Force and Navy proved this reality in engagement after engagement, in large battles like Operation Bolo that destroyed half of North Vietnam's MiG-21 fleet in 15 minutes, in small encounters where individual Phantom crews engaged multiple MiGs simultaneously using radar to track targets and missiles to kill from beyond the range where Vietnamese fighters could respond, in the relentless accumulation of exchange ratios that averaged 3-to-1 or better throughout the war, despite North Vietnamese tactical evolution and Soviet technological assistance that provided the most capable systems Warsaw Pact industry could produce. The moment when North Vietnamese commanders and pilots fully understood the scale of their technological disadvantage probably came not during Operation Bolo, which could be explained as a tactical surprise that superior vigilance might have prevented, but during Operation Linebacker Oswai in 1972, when the Vietnam People's Air Force committed its entire strength to defending against American strikes and still achieved exchange ratios that would have destroyed the force several times over, except for Soviet and Chinese replacement aircraft. The 49-to-9 kill ratio from May to October 1972 demonstrated that 8 years of learning had not closed the technology gap, that even with improved tactics and better training and more experienced pilots, North Vietnamese fighters simply could not defeat F-4 Phantoms when Americans employed their systems according to doctrine, and this realization forced a fundamental recalibration of Vietnamese strategy that accepted fighter forces existed primarily to complicate American operations rather than to achieve air superiority through conventional means. The factories that produced F-4 Phantoms at McDonnell Douglas facilities in St. Louis, Missouri, represented industrial capabilities that North Vietnam and the Soviet Union could observe but never replicate at the sophistication levels required for modern fighter production, the manufacturing processes, requiring precision machining, advanced materials, complex electronics assembly, system integration testing, quality control procedures that took years to develop and billions of dollars to implement. The United States built 5,195 F-4 Phantoms between 1958 and 1981, each aircraft containing approximately 54,000 feet of wiring, 643,000 individual fasteners, radar systems whose complexity exceeded most Vietnamese ground installations, engines that delivered thrust-to-weight ratios Soviet designers would not match for another decade. This industrial base allowed American forces to replace combat losses faster than North Vietnam could inflict them, to introduce improved variants with better capabilities as lessons from combat drove requirements, to maintain hundreds of Phantoms in theater simultaneously while also deploying the type to Europe and the Pacific and providing aircraft to Allied air forces worldwide, a production and sustainment capability that demonstrated how technological superiority emerged from industrial depth rather than individual engineering brilliance. North Vietnamese pilots who flew against this industrial and technological juggernaut understood they were facing not just superior aircraft, but an entire system of capability generation that their country could never match, that every F-4 Phantom represented decades of research investment, billions of dollars in development funding, manufacturing infrastructure built over generations, trained workforces numbering in the tens of thousands, all focused on creating weapon systems that pushed the boundaries of what aerospace technology could deliver. The gap was not merely between the F-4 and the MiG-17 or MiG-21, it was between industrial civilizations operating at fundamentally different levels of technological sophistication, between a superpower that could design and build advanced radar systems as routine engineering projects and a developing nation that depended entirely on foreign suppliers for military technology more complex than small arms. This reality shaped every engagement, informed every tactical decision, created the context in which Vietnamese pilots flew, knowing their aircraft were outclassed before they even started engines, knowing that survival depended more on American political constraints than on their own skills or courage or tactical brilliance. The final accounting of air-to-air combat between F-4 Phantoms and North Vietnamese fighters showed 150.5 MiG kills credited to Phantom crews from all services against 42 Phantoms lost in aerial combat, a 3.6 to 1 overall exchange ratio that would have been even more favorable, except that American rules of engagement prevented beyond visual range shots in many circumstances and required visual identification that negated the Phantom's primary technological advantage. When F-4 crews could employ their systems without constraints, when they could shoot radar-guided Sparrows at targets detected by the AN/APQ-100 radar from beyond visual range, when they could use their speed to dictate engagement geometry and their missiles to kill from distances where MiGs could not respond, exchange ratios climbed into double digits, as Operation Bolo demonstrated by destroying 7 MiG-21s without loss. The 150.5 confirmed kills represented only the victories that could be verified through multiple sources. Actual F-4 effectiveness was likely higher because many engagements occurred over North Vietnam, where crashed aircraft could not be confirmed, and Vietnamese propaganda systematically undercounted losses to maintain morale, meaning the technological dominance was even more complete than statistics suggested. The sky over Phuc Yen Air Base on January 2, 1967, where Captain Nguyen Van Coc had ejected from his burning MiG-21 after being shot down by an F-4 Phantom's radar-guided missile, became a symbol for every North Vietnamese pilot who would follow him into combat against technologically superior enemies throughout the remaining 6 years of American air operations. A reminder that courage and skill and tactical innovation could create moments of success, but could not overcome systematic advantages in detection range and missile performance and aircraft speed that allowed American fighters to engage and kill from distances where Vietnamese aircraft posed no threat in return. The 7 MiG-21s destroyed that day, half of North Vietnam's entire supersonic fighter fleet eliminated in 15 minutes of combat, represented not merely a tactical defeat, but a fundamental demonstration that the F-4 Phantom II, with its Mach 2.23 speed and beyond visual range weapons, operated in a different category of capability from anything the Vietnam People's Air Force could deploy, that the technological gap was so wide that closing it through tactics or training or determination was simply impossible when Americans employed their systems according to doctrine rather than accepting the limitations that North Vietnamese strategy tried to impose on them. For the North Vietnamese pilots who survived the war, who flew hundreds of missions knowing their aircraft were outclassed, who watched friends die to radar-guided missiles fired from ranges where they could not even identify their attackers, who ejected from burning MiGs destroyed by enemies they never saw, the F-4 Phantom became the symbol of American technological superiority that no amount of revolutionary spirit could defeat, the aircraft that proved technology mattered more than courage when the gap reached proportions that tactics could not bridge. They learned this lesson in Operation Bolo, relearned it in Operation Linebacker, confirmed it in every engagement where American fighters employed their capabilities without political constraint, and carried the knowledge through decades of peacetime that their victories came not from defeating superior enemies, but from surviving long enough that American politics forced an end to combat operations. The Mach 2 speed that allowed F-4 Phantoms to dictate every engagement, the radar systems that could detect MiGs from 30 miles away, the missile systems that could kill from beyond the range where Vietnamese fighters could respond, these capabilities combined to create air superiority so complete that North Vietnam's integrated air defense succeeded only because surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery could kill what fighters could not stop, because survival became the definition of victory when fighting enemies whose technology made conventional air combat a mathematics of attrition that favored Americans so heavily that continued resistance required accepting unsustainable loss rates as the price of political will. The F-4 Phantom II flew in combat over North Vietnam from April 1965 to January 1973, 8 years during which it established a record of dominance so complete that fighter-versus-fighter combat became a secondary concern for American planners who knew their Phantoms could destroy any MiG force the Vietnam People's Air Force committed to battle, the only questions being whether political constraints would allow beyond visual range shots and whether enough MiGs would rise to make the engagement worth the fuel expenditure. This absolute confidence in technological superiority shaped American strategy, influenced targeting decisions, determined force allocations, created the context in which air operations proceeded with the certainty that fighter escorts could handle any aerial threat while strike packages focused on delivering ordnance to targets. The statistics justified this confidence. The 150.5 confirmed MiG kills against 42 Phantom losses in air combat, demonstrating that even when North Vietnamese tactics evolved to their highest levels of sophistication, even when Soviet technology provided the most capable systems Warsaw-packed factories could produce, the F-4's systematic advantages in detection and engagement and speed made victory nearly certain whenever Americans chose to fight. And for North Vietnam, for the pilots who flew knowing they were outclassed, for the commanders who sent them into battles they could not win, for the nation that depended on their sacrifice even when sacrifice achieved only delay rather than victory, the F-4 Phantom represented the technological reality of modern warfare, where industrial capacity and engineering sophistication mattered more than revolutionary determination, where radar and missiles delivered capabilities that courage could not overcome, where speed measured in Mach numbers created advantages that tactics could not defeat. They faced this reality every time they climbed into MiG-17 cockpits, knowing American radar could see them from 30 miles away, every time they tried to employ MiG-21 atoll missiles that required perfect geometry against enemies who could shoot from any angle, every time they watched radar-guided Sparrows destroy squadron mates from distances where Vietnamese fighters could not even identify the Phantoms that killed them. The war taught them that technology gaps of this magnitude could not be closed through skill or bravery or tactical innovation, that survival itself became victory when fighting enemies whose industrial civilization produced weapon systems a generation ahead of anything Soviet technology could provide, and that lesson shaped Vietnamese strategy for the remainder of the war as they accepted that air superiority was impossible, and focused instead on making American operations costly enough that political will would fail before Vietnamese resources were exhausted. The wreckage of 7 MiG-21s scattered across the rice paddies surrounding Phuc Yen Air Base on the evening of January 2, 1967, told the story of what happened when North Vietnamese fighters met F-4 Phantoms in combat on American terms, when radar detected them from beyond their ability to respond, when missiles killed from ranges their weapons could never match, when speed allowed enemies to dictate every aspect of tactical engagement, and the lesson written in Burning Aluminum and Dead Pilots was that the Vietnam People's Air Force could only survive by avoiding fair fights against technological superiority that made courage and skill and determination insufficient substitutes for modern weapon systems. This was the reality that North Vietnam was outclassed by America's F-4 Phantom and Mach 2 speed, a technological mismatch so fundamental that 8 years of combat could not close the gap, could not find the tactical solution, could not overcome through determination what industrial capacity and engineering sophistication had built into the physics of radar detection and missile performance and supersonic flight, leaving Vietnamese pilots to face enemies they could acknowledge but never defeat. to fight wars they could survive but never win, to carry memories of watching American technology prove that in modern aerial combat, the side with better sensors and longer-range weapons and faster aircraft would dominate regardless of the courage of the pilots flying inferior machines against them.